Thank you, Chair. There's one thing that I'm quite struck by in today's hearing. We have Amazon, Microsoft, and BDO here, three very large and serious companies, clearly. It's clear that you're taking this hearing seriously and that you've done a lot of detailed preparation. That's not an endorsement of everything you've said necessarily, but you're clearly taking this seriously. And there is a stark contrast between your testimony and the testimony of GC Strategies and Dalian that we've heard before Parliament. Two-person companies that specialize only in getting government contracts, that were completely unprepared, that were unable to answer critical questions and badly contradicted themselves. And yet, the government has gone to GC Strategies to do most of this project, mostly through sole sourcing, and government officials at one point conspired with GC Strategies to get them parts of this deal. So it seems like a big demonstration of problems in our procurement system that the government has repeatedly gone to GC Strategies and Dalian in spite of the obvious problems that have been well on display before committees. I want to ask each of you, if your company would have had the capacity to build the ArriveCAN app yourself, and if you could have built all of it or at least done more of it, why didn't you? Why do you think it ended up that it was GC Strategies and Dalian instead of some of these names that Canadians would recognize? So we'll start with Microsoft on that, as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. So Microsoft is a partner-driven company. We have 16,500 partners in Canada that build atop a platform. And so our business model is to enable Canadian organizations to build this type of capability.
So you could have built it?
We don't build these types of
But your
tools.
Partner companies could have
Correct.
built it. And why? So why didn't you? Why didn't you put in a proposal to the government for your partners to build the app?
So our partners would lead that. We would not lead that proposal. Okay. So we were 100% reliant on partners to build on those specialized solutions.
Okay, but why did none of your partners do this?
I can't answer for my partners.
Okay, Mr. Abbott.
Sure, and I listen. I certainly haven't seen all of the specs and requirements and stakeholders required for ArriveCAN. I can speak to
it's an app, though, basically.
The piece it is, but I can only speak to the pieces that we've seen. And I certainly would not second guess the Auditor General and their findings in terms of what that looked like. Don't have the same level of access to that to those specifications. So to the question of could we have done that, it's speculative. I don't have access to all of the requirements that were there. I realize it's an app, but there's some complicated features, as we found in the optical reader technology.
Did you look into building it though? I mean,
we never looked at building it.
And why didn't you look into building it?
Simply at the time we didn't have the capabilities when this started. We do now. But we didn't.
Ms. Foster?
My answer is very similar to my Microsoft colleague. I can add a bit of.
Well, I get the impression that people don't want to go too far down the road of being critical of the procurement process. It just, and I don't want to press you but it seems like a clear problem to me that big companies, names that Canadians recognize, didn't even think to bid on this critical project, and yet we went to GC Strategies, to Dalian, to these two-person shops that did no work and subcontracted it with all of the attendant problems.
To share a couple of quick things for your consideration and the consideration of this committee. AWS would not have been on a contract like this. It is not the kind of work that we do. However, there are two factors that I think the committee may want to take note of. One is the continued underinvestment in the improving the digital skills of the public service. That is a long-term systemic problem. And, in addition to whether or not public servants could build this, that could be part of the answer. But in addition to that, that part of it is you also don't have procurement officials that understand how to procure these systems properly and design the projects and manage the projects. So it's not just hiring builders, it's also hiring a public service and building a public service that has far stronger digital skills than you have today.
And just to comment on that, I mean, the government's position seems to have been that they're not capable of performing a general contracting function for going out and finding the talent to build an app, which is why they contracted to companies who then subcontracted on most of the work. It's clearly a broken system that that the government put it out to companies that simply went on LinkedIn, found people, and subcontracted it. I don't know if it's interference or if it's a lack of digital skills or something else, but clearly the system is
Mr.
badly
Genuous,
broken.
that is your time. Ms. Shanahan, noted. I'll turn now to Mr. Genuous, the second last member. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please, and Mr. Chen will finish up for the day. Over to you, Mr. Genuous.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Foster, I want to ask you about the contracts that Amazon had with Dalian. You had said earlier worth $1.1 million in total. Were all of these contracts ones for which CBSA was the ultimate beneficiary of the work?
Yes. So the initial program of work was really related to a migration that had nothing to do. They needed.
I understand they were distinct from ArriveCAN. Yeah.
Okay. So they needed assistance with migrating workloads to the cloud. That support was provided, and then there was it is less than $100,000 of work that could be that we can sort of identify as being related to ArriveCAN, but it was a very minimal amount of work.
So it was migrating services to the cloud, doing that for Dalian, for which CBSA was the ultimate beneficiary. Were there multiple companies working for Dalian on these projects, or were basically you were the ones that were providing that work for Dalian?
On this one, we would have no line of sight on who Dalian was working with outside of us.
Okay, but for the specific project, you didn't have line of sight on any other companies involved. They received a contract for CBSA to do what in general? To do that same migration?
We don't know specifically what their contract was for with CBSA. And in the case of this migration piece of work, we just had our own contract. We were not working with any other firms at the time and had no visibility.
Okay, but these were CBSA files or CBSA information? It wasn't Dalian internal files. It was CBSA's information that you were moving to the cloud as part of a contract that you had with Dalian. Is that correct?
It was CBSA workloads.
Right. Okay. So you were moving CBSA workloads to the cloud, but Dalian had hired you to do that. Dalian is notionally an indigenous company, which means that it benefits from indigenous set-asides in procurement. Is Amazon an indigenous company, and were any of the employees who worked on this project for Dalian indigenous?
No, we are not an indigenous company, and there may have been employees that were indigenous that worked on the project, but I can't say yes or no.
Okay. Do you have a sense of what percentage of your overall workforce is indigenous?
We do in Canada, but I don't recall that number off the top of my head.
Okay, ballpark, is it the same as the proportion in the overall population, a little higher, a little lower?
That would be a good ballpark, but I'm honestly not sure.
Okay. What I'm trying to understand about the procurement system here is that Dalian identifies as an indigenous company. It benefits from indigenous set-asides in getting procurement. In the case of these projects with CBSA, they may have, in the process of getting this contract, benefited from that set-aside. They then subcontracted to you, but pardon me, they didn't subcontract to you. As you said, they hired you to do the work, and you are not an indigenous company. So that it seems like a good deal for you. You were hired to do work. It seems like a good deal for Dalian in that they don't have internal IT capacity. They presumably didn't add value to the project. They made money. You made money, but because of their involvement, taxpayers paid more, and this seems like a pretty significant manipulation of the indigenous set-aside rule. Do you have a sense of why Amazon didn't just get this contract directly to move those files to the cloud? Is it because of a requirement around indigenous procurement, or is there some other reason why you didn't get that contract directly?
So we don't have visibility on what the overall scope of work was that Dalian was hired to do by the Government of Canada. So for, there could have been a much broader scope of work that included other potential elements that were delivered as part of their contract with the Government of Canada. So there's a lot of information we don't have to confirm some of your suspicions. In terms of why the Government of Canada did not procure with us directly, at the time the government did not have the ability to procure cloud services. They did not have.
Sorry, what does that mean? They don't have the ability to procure cloud
They
services?
didn't have a procurement vehicle to buy cloud.
So
they didn't-
essentially, they didn't have the bureaucratic structures in place.
Correct.
Okay, but that seems like a bizarre and arbitrary barrier. You're the ones that can do the work. They need you to do the work. But for some bureaucratic and technical reason, they decided they had to go through Dalian when they could have just called you and hired you.
I think you are pointing to some of the elements of why having really good procurement policies in place is really important. So having appropriate practices and policies in place to buy the technology that you need is an extremely important element in thinking about any digital transformation initiative, whether you're a government or a private sector enterprise. There are elements that you have to have in place in order to do things well. One of those, which I've mentioned earlier, is the appropriate kind of talent and workforce to actually lead the project. Another really important element is the ability to actually procure what you need and have the right rules around the procurement of that technology. The third actually is an extremely important element for the people in this room, and that is leadership. These are change management projects. They require leadership in order to drive and ensure that they're able to be executed. Change management is extremely difficult in any organization, and it's especially difficult in a public sector one. And then the fourth is understanding how to actually budget for operational expenses in an IT environment. Traditional IT procurement is for capital assets, and most organizations are still grappling with how to budget for those expenses in an operational sense. So there's a number of elements of what the Government of Canada and all organizations are grappling with in order to have those elements of how to do digital transformation appropriately. So
Actually,
not
Ms.
having
Foster,
policies
Ms. Foster, I'm
in
going to
place is a
stop
key
you there,
element of the challenge.
but I am sure our next member will probably ask you to continue if they're of interest. I'm just way over the time for Mr. Genuis's